Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are going to focus on Father Walter Ciszek, who is a Jesuit priest who spent a whole heck of a lot of time behind the Iron Curtain before people even started calling it the Iron Curtain. And was a great author and lived a really great life. And so the person who we are pleased to have join us today is Jim Keane, who is the senior editor of America Media, for a long time known as America Magazine, that was a part of the Jesuits, and Father Ciszek was a Jesuit, and so we're glad to learn a heck of a lot more about him today in our conversation. Jim, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Nick. It's good to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, talk to us about Walter Ciszek. I mean, he's an American, right? I mean, but of Polish ancestry, is that right?
He was. His parents were immigrants from Poland. They had settled in a kind of coal country of Pennsylvania, outside Scranton, a town called Shenandoah,
Okay.
and grew up there. Kind of a tough kid, actually. If you read
Hmm.
his autobiography, both With God and Russia, or He Leadeth Me, he talks about fighting with being in a gang, fighting with the locals.
Hmm.
But he decided from a fairly young age he did want to be a Catholic priest. The influence of other priests he had met, and then his family was Catholic and religious. And he ended up becoming a Jesuit. At the time the biggest Catholic religious order in the United States, all men. And he went to study. Jesuit formation takes a long time, usually about 12
Okay.
years.
Really?
So he's born in 1904, but he's not really ordained until mid 30s. And then he
You mean
signed
in the
up to
I'm sorry, his mid 30s or the mid 1930s?
the mid 1930s. He would have
Okay,
been
which is
around
about
30. I don't know exactly how old. He would have been around 30.
okay,
That's usually
okay,
about when. Because
okay.
you do a couple years as a novice, a couple years studying philosophy, a couple years working, a couple years studying theology,
Hmm.
then you're ordained. So
Okay.
there's a joke about the Jesuits is that ordination is the reward for a life well lived. But it takes a long time. But anyway, he
Okay.
signed up to go basically to Russia eventually. So he was in Rome studying, and he was actually working in Poland as a priest when World War II broke out. And of
Oh,
course, we always think of the Germans invading Poland, but of course, the Soviet Union just took the other half of Poland
right.
as part of the von Ribbentrop Pact, and so he then was behind Russian lines. Soviet lines, and he got some fake papers and was working in secret as a day. He was his cover was a day laborer, but he was ministering in Russia to some of what Catholics call the Eastern Catholic churches, churches that are in union with the papacy, so they're not Russian Orthodox. But they sometimes more resemble the Orthodox churches in their worship and their
Hmm.
practices.
Okay.
Uh, Got caught in 1941 and was sentenced to hard labor. Was accused of being a spy. Obviously, these trials in the KGB headquarters were not, sort of a foregone conclusion, right?
Right.
Uh, and so they accused him of being a spy. He's found guilty, threatened him with various other things, but in the end, just sentenced him to hard labor, which was in Siberia, so it was no joke, right?
Wow.
Um, so he was in various labor camps in Siberia and no contact at all with the outside world. The last time his family had heard from him was in 1940. So his
Hmm.
family back home just thought he was dead. That,
Hmm.
one of the sides, the Germans, the Soviets, someone had killed him in the war, or the KGB had gotten him after the war. Uh, so he was doing kind of a little bit of like secret ministry in these prison camps, saying mass, hearing confessions, but he was also working alongside the other folks. And
Hmm.
if you read either of his two books, one is called With God in Russia, the other one is He Leadeth Me. He'll talk about the conditions in those camps, the struggle to stay warm, to get hot food,
Hmm.
to kind of live a life of dignity when you're really mistreated at every turn. Uh, Eventually, he does finish out his prison term, but the Soviets say, okay, you can't go home. It's the middle of the Cold War at this point. So you got to stay here. You can live in one of these industrial cities, sort of in Siberia. So, he's not in St. Petersburg or Moscow or something like that. He's in Novosibirsk, places like that. And eventually he's able to get out a letter to his family, 1955, and they smuggle him an overcoat and some other things, but there's no real contact. Nor, I mean, your older listeners might remember this, nor are the Americans really sure that this is actually Walter Ciszek, right?
Mm.
Because there's all this sort of spy game stuff going on. And so they don't know who they're really talking to. I mean, it could be anyone.
Wow.
So eventually, during the presidency of John F. Kennedy, he exchanges some Soviet spies for a kid who had been accused of spying for the Soviets and then for Ciszek. So it comes home in 1963, and these two Jesuits who had known him as a young man pick him up at what we call Kennedy Airport now, Idlewild then,
Hmm.
and he's kind of unrecognizable to them. And they're not sure, is it just 20 years of hard labor that have made him look like this, or is this not really Walter Ciszek?
Mm.
But they had all done their novitiate and their juniorate in the Jesuits, their first couple years of training, out in the middle of Pennsylvania in this town called Wernersville, which had a huge, housing for a couple hundred guys, 250 acres with all sorts of ball fields, a swimming hole, a farm, a chapel, a rosary walk, all these things, Mary Grotto. So what they did was they had one of his classmates from when he was been a novice, so when he was 18, drive him there and then drive around the property and he would stop and he'd be like, "All right, Walter, what's over the next hill?" Or
Really?
what are we going to see when we turn this corner? Figuring that the Soviets could never find a spy.
Right.
So anyway, so then he starts working in kind of
And so
ecumenical.
he passes the test, right? I
He
mean,
passes.
okay, all right.
He passes, and so he was sort of a celebrity in a way, which I think did not really fit well for him because first of all he was sort of a humble guy, and second of all he had been gone for all these years. The United States in 1963 looks nothing
Mm.
like the place he left in 1938, right?
Right.
And so he started working in ecumenical relations uh, at Fordham, and he started working with this Jesuit who was on staff at America, Dan Flaherty, on writing down what happened to him and his spiritual reflections, but also just the nitty gritty. And they, finally finished their manuscript and they put it all together. And it's 1,500 pages long,
Wow.
right? Which no publisher wants.
All
No
right.
publisher wants. So they boiled it down to a couple hundred. And that eventually came out as With God in Russia. So
Okay.
big, over the years, has been sort of continuously, if not a bestseller, a real spiritual classic.
Mm.
People still read it by today. We still have the copyright to it. And folks over the years have talked about making a movie of it or making a miniseries of it. And then years later in the 70s, he wrote another book called He Leadeth Me, which is more of
Hmm.
a spiritual autobiography. I think he told
Yeah.
people He Leadeth Me is what the book he really wanted to write, but he had to get all the facts out. And then he also wrote a lot for America Magazine, where I work today,
Oh, okay.
on his reflections on the United States, his reflections on different issues. And he could be pretty harsh because he was very critical of American materialism. He
Mm.
said, the amount of food that gets wasted, or to see a family give the dog more meat than a person in the Soviet Union would eat, in a week, or just the sort of food that was thrown away at the end of the meal, because over the years he had just become so careful about, he'd become an ascetic basically by
Yeah.
necessity.
Right.
And so he died in 1984. His name was has sort of rung out ever since with the Jesuits. So the Jesuit First Studies House in Fordham is Chiswick Hall.
Okay.
And his cause for canonization was open for a number of years with the Altoona Jonestown Diocese, I think it is, in Pennsylvania. And he became sort of a hero to different groups. Sainthood in the Catholic Church, people kind of have their favorites, the patron saint of this, the patron saint of that.
Hmm.
And I think he was sort of a patron saint of missionaries, but also patron saint of prisoners. He would have been. I mean, he was not canonized. Um, and so many people over the years have just become very sort of captured by this very vivid life and ministry and the toughness of this guy.
Yeah.
You feel like when you read it, you feel like you're like he must have looked like Newt Rockney or something, right? So it's a very inspiring story. I wrote about him a couple times for the magazine, and I went through our archives to find his old stories. Um, Certainly, I myself, when I was in college, someone gave me With God in Russia to read. So yeah, great, interesting story.
No doubt about that. Hey, we're really enjoying our conversation here with Jim Keane. We're talking all about Father Walter Ciszek. So, a couple of things just keep running through my head here. One is when he wrote "He Leadeth Me," or maybe let me say about when with the one that came out about Russia, right?
Yeah, With God in Russia.
With
Yeah.
God in Russia. Excuse me. Yes. Did were there State Department other people that were like, "Hey, check this book out. We've been trying to tell you these guys are really bad over there," and the kind of Cold War fervor or any of that used the book to kind of promote a political piece?
I think that over the years that definitely has been the case. He himself was very clear that he did not consider himself a political person,
Okay.
right? He obviously had no great love for his captors, but that he didn't want, he would say in his writings, he didn't want to get involved in political disputes he didn't necessarily understand. The other issue with the first book is that some of these people he's writing about were still alive
Mm,
in the Soviet Union. And so they had to be careful because they knew that the Soviets were going to read this book. Uh,
right.
and so they had to be careful with names and places. And so,
Okay.
that also came into it that at certain points, I think people were like, can we really publish this or do we need to wait? The Jesuits, there's this phrase that you sometimes hear in Rome, in the Vatican, which is cunctando regitur mundus. It's by waiting is the world won. And
Okay.
so sometimes someone will write a memoir and they'll be like, we're going to publish this like 50 years after you're dead, right? So everybody's dead, and so it was, I think with God in Russia, they had to be careful about who and what they named and what they described. And then, yes, of course, you're right. I mean, this is the height of the Cold War, right? I mean, it's 1963.
Right.
And so there were definitely many people who also saw him as a hero of sort of a democracy that allowed freedom of religion, of a
Hmm.
country that had, had an embrace of Christianity that had, at that time in the 60s, was also sending out its own missionaries. In the Catholic Church, you would have had many religious sisters, but also many Jesuits, Maryknollers, different groups going out to places like China, um, uh, Latin America, Africa. Maryknoll suffered terrible losses in 1949 and in the early 50s in China when their men were captured, some of them imprisoned for years. So I think that you're right, is that there is a connection there. Even if Father Ciszek himself didn't want to be a political person, there is a sense in which it fit that genre of
Yeah.
here's an inspiring tale,
Right. Did they put him on the rubber chicken circuit? I mean, did he go out and talk about it and have speeches and do that kind of a thing just to promote the whole idea of the book and what he, or is probably from his perspective, much more of a faith sharing opportunity than it would be. But I would think if you were drawing a crowd and you were talking about whether you were pounding the desk or not, right? The message then starts to get underpinned, if not blatant, to the people hearing it about, man, this communism stuff. We got to be doing yeah, let's go send some more troops to Vietnam, or I'm dragging it out and making something up, but I'm just thinking
yeah.
that might be in some context to that.
Yeah, well, I think that certainly the people I have met who actually had met him
Hmm.
knew him through like retreats he gave or lectures
Ah,
he gave at Fordham,
okay.
and then maybe back in his hometown. one of the things that happened in the church, in the Catholic Church in the 60s, is you have the Second Vatican Council going
Hmm.
on from 62 to 65. Some of the most famous theologians who helped out with that council did go on the rubber chicken circuit in the U.S. So people like Karl Rahner and Edward Schillebeeckx and Hans Kung, these are names that are probably internal to Catholics for the most part, but they were going touring around the United States. But they were a little more charismatic, a little more flair, where I
Mm.
think Father Ciszek was a little more no nonsense and probably not the best public speaker. Um, but that's a good question. I would have to look that up to see if how much he was on the road.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
just it's not like the book circuit that you might get on of these days, right? They want to know how many appearances you're going to make and book signings you're going to do. That wasn't a part of it. But then
Well, before I came here to America, I worked for a book publisher, and I used to tell my authors, I said, one thing, one virtue that your publisher doesn't want you to have is humility. We want you to be a narcissistic, attention grubbing, you know. We want you out there looking for every last set of eyes on you.
two or more gathered, show
Yeah.
up, right? I mean, that's where you need to be. But my guess is somebody that would have spent that much time, as we would say, behind the Iron Curtain, and in that time, that's probably was not his mojo, right? I mean,
No,
it's
and I
not
think
his.
also he was. I think some of these guys, like the way they survive a situation like that,
You're right.
is, and this is similar to Maryknoll Bishop Francis Ford, who was imprisoned in China in the 50s. Is that one of the ways you survive mentally and physically is by being a person of extreme discipline
Mm,
and of routine and ritual. You get up at the same time every day. You do this, you do that. And that's how your faith stays strong. That's how your body stays strong. It's just by
hmm
following a very strict, ordo of how your day goes. And so I think that he probably was a homebody for the most part.
hmm
Um, uh, um, but like I said, the book itself was extraordinarily popular.
Sure. Sure. How did they were there ever any stories of him connecting back with some of the people that he was in the gulag? I wasn't the gulag, right? But I mean, it was at least in those prisons and part of that they connected afterwards, or were they any Soviets that came around and ended up in the U.S. later and said, this guy, gave me communion when I was, when I needed it, or any of those type of things?
I do think that I'm trying to think where I read this, but I do think that he did give an interview once where he talked about some of the people who had made it out, because by the time he died in 84, so I mean, that's Reagan era, so maybe the Cold War's heightened up a little bit, but there had been détente in the 70s,
Sure.
and there had been some rapprochement between the two sides. And so there may have been other people who came out, prisoner exchanges, various things. Um, one of the uh, uh, connections with the Jesuits is that it's a worldwide organization, and so
Hmm.
it's easier to get in touch across borders than it might be if you're in like
Oh,
a
okay.
political war, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know if you ever read any Tom Clancy, but Clancy had a very vivid imagination. But one of his novels, one of the plot lines is there's these Jesuits who are passing secrets back and forth by speaking in Attic Greek, which you know, maybe not. But and anyway, I do think there would have been a network where he would have actually met both priests and lay people who he had met, behind the Iron Curtain for sure.
Right.
And obviously, all those people now would be long dead. But for
Sure.
the years when he was back in the U.S., for sure.
So what about his family back home? Were his parents living during most of this time? Did they end up passing, thinking they never knew that their son, that they just assumed he died during the war, or brothers or sisters or anybody else like that connected with
I
him?
don't know the specific details of the family, but his last letter before the war, well, the war had already started, but before the U.S. was in it, was
Hmm.
1940. So
Okay.
he would have been 36. And then the next one is 1955. So he's 51. So his parents would have still been alive. I mean, but again, remember that they can't be entirely sure they're talking to the right guy.
Right.
Uh, it's easy enough for the Soviets to grill a guy find out every detail about his life, and then, have use that as a sort of honey trap or, bait
Right, right. Please write me back, mom and dad, and tell me
Yeah, yeah,
about this,
yeah,
this, that, and the other, and how this is going. And didn't we have a third cousin that worked for the governor, or whatever? Right?
yeah,
Tell me
yeah,
more about that guy.
yeah, yeah. Well, who's working at the defense plant these days?
Right.
For sure. And so, but I do think that I mean, they knew he was alive. I
Mhm.
don't think they thought they would ever see him again. And
Okay.
I would have to look it up, but I think his parents were probably deceased by the time he came home because they would have been very elderly by
Sure.
1963. Um, and he himself also, I mean, there are health consequences for living that way for so long too. So I think he was not always in great health himself, in
Mm.
the
I'm
70s and
sure.
80s.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Wow. What a fascinating person, I mean, and who knew maybe, as you were saying, growing up as a young kid, being a scrapper, maybe that showed up in the Soviet Union 30 years later, and you didn't know, right? That
Yeah.
your
And
toughness was something you're going to need, right?
yeah, and I don't know where I read this, if it was in With God in Russia, or if it was in He Leadeth Me, or if it was in something else. But he talked about, there's that area of Pennsylvania, there's a lot of anthracite coal mines, still is
Hmm.
today, and anthracite coal, there'd be broken pieces of it, and they called them clinkers, a piece of it. And he said it made a good weapon, like get one the size of a baseball. It's got pretty hard edges. But he talks about what it was like to get hit by a clinker, and I think in some ways, it was training to make him a
Yeah.
very, very tough kid.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kind of like Joseph in the well, right? Who
Right.
knew how he was going to have to toughen up, that know that
Yeah.
that was that how that was going how that was going to end up to be. So within Jesuits, is he kind of part of the ongoing curricula as you're becoming a novice or something? Is he like somebody that the Jesuits would study about and to learn more about his ministry?
I think your average vocation director certainly has that in his quiver to give out for sure,
Mhm.
because it was certainly it would be one of a number of books that you would give to a young man, and also it shows up in other places. Last year in the Super Bowl, this app was launched, Hallow, a prayer app.
Yes,
I don't
right,
know if you remember
right.
that. Sort of
I
Mark
do.
Wahlberg was one of the
Hmm.
guys. Well,
Hmm.
that app gives you daily prayer reflections. Um, Chiswick is in those. Father
Oh, really?
Chiswick yeah, his story is part of that, some of those reflections. I'm not all that technologically sophisticated, so I've never used the app, but he is one of the sort of figures that they use as like an inspirational story to encourage more sort of deeper prayer, more emotional prayer, both his story and his writings. So even
Oh,
beyond
great.
the Jesuits, he sort of has reached a larger audience in that sense.
Yes.
Um, yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. Well, tell us about American media. Tell me what all you guys do now, and what as how that I'm sure has grown over the years, and getting into all different types of media itself, right?
Yeah, right. And you're kind to say America Media because we were always America Magazine or
Yeah.
America Press, but over the last about 15 years, we have gone by America Media because now there's podcasts and there's all sorts of digital stuff. The magazine is from 1909. We're one of the older periodicals in the United States, but it was a weekly for many, many years. The staff was entirely Jesuits, more or less,
Mm.
Jesuit priests. Something that's changed over the last 20 years. Now the staff is mostly lay folks. But eventually we went to a more online in the 2000s. So now we still do a monthly print edition, but the magazine's mostly online. The focus is sort of on faith, culture, the arts, with sort of maybe specific um, attention paid to Ignatian spirituality, the teachings of
Hmm.
St. Ignatius. Uh, we try to provide people with a source of information about things like the papacy. What is the Pope doing? What are the bishops doing? And so we had one editor who said we want to be the Catholic CNN. We had another one who said, well, what we want to be is we want to teach the church about the world, and we want to teach the world about the church.
Ah, yeah.
So it's a little bit it's an evangelical enterprise, a missionary ethos, even if it's not really a missionary organization. We're trying to reach both Catholics and Christians, and also non-Catholics and Christians. And
Hmm.
so, like for example, like I'm also the book reviews editor, and
Okay.
so every issue has a bunch of book reviews. We have film reviews. We have music reviews. We have a news editor. We have a couple podcasts. One for young folks in their 20s and 30s. Father Jim Martin is kind of our most famous editor, and he has a podcast on the spiritual life. Um, and yeah, so we're sponsored by the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, but we have a
Hmm.
board of directors here in New York City, and we're right at the corner of 6th Avenue and 48th Street. So if I look out the window one direction, I can see New Jersey, and if I look straight ahead, I can see Central Park, and if I look to
Okay.
the right, I can see Brooklyn.
Wow.
We're actually right across the street from Fox News.
Are you really?
So
Okay.
yesterday, the vice president was there appearing on The View, I think,
Okay.
and so that snarls traffic,
I bet. I
especially when
bet.
the World Cup is going on and the Knicks have just won the
Right,
championship.
right. Get out of there before that parade hits. I don't know if it
Yeah,
started yet, but everybody, all I've heard about was about that. Obviously, puts our time frame here that we're doing the of how we're doing the podcast. But
yeah,
that's a great time to be a part of that. Well, that's
yeah.
fantastic. And so, if I want to learn more about American media and about that, where would I? Where am I going to find you? Website, socials,
So
all
yeah, so
that.
the website would be americamagazine.org or americamedia.org. And then if you were to Google America Jesuit Magazine, it would come up right away. And then in terms of multimedia stuff, our podcasts are things like one's called Jesuitical, sort of a play on the old joke that Jesuits were sneaky, and Jesuitical originally meant dishonest and cunning. Then the spiritual life or Father Jim Martin, stuff like that. And then we still have a print magazine too. So if Catholics, sometimes they might see it in the vestibule in the back of their church, or
Mm,
they might see it at the library, or we try to make sure they get passed around too. I had an
right.
aunt who was a Marymount nun, and she said that well, we only buy one subscription, but about 8 of us read it. And so we do still have the print edition, which still has a pretty robust subscription base, but a lot of our content is online.
Sure.
And a week like this, Pope Leo, it's the first American-born Pope. Americans are very interested in him. He just did a foreign trip where he went to Spain, and kind of a very dramatic trip. And we have two Vatican correspondents who
Huh. Okay.
were reporting on that. And it's funny sometimes the culture. I mean, I don't think of myself as an old man, but sometimes I realize I am, because the Pope met with Bad Bunny,
Oh,
this
you had to
musician.
look
I
up who
mean,
that was?
well, we read a story on it, and I was like, well, I don't know who that is, but 40,000 people clearly clicked on it. But we do try to keep up, au courant with the arts, with
Sure.
culture, and that also with the larger Christianity, in the sense, if I had to give an analog to someone from either mainline or evangelical Protestantism, I would say we're kind of the Catholic version of Christianity today, or
Hmm.
Christian century.
Mm. There you go. Very good. Well, we love Christianity Today, by the way, and they are big supporters of what we do, and
Oh,
so we
great,
we
great.
we 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 appreciate part of that too. And so some of our greatest podcast episodes we've had have come from some folks who have talked about we did one episode on other reformations that you may have never heard of, and kind of
Hmm.
in conjunction with the Council of Trent and what that was like to do too. So we've certainly enjoyed a lot of that conversation. Well, Jim Keane, thank you so much for spending time with us and giving us some insight into Father Walter Ciszek and who he was and what an impact he had and what a great part of a ministry he had as well too.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Thank you and your whole staff for having me.
Absolutely.
Yes. God bless.